Hey everybody, hope you're all doing well and studying for that AP exam. This PowerPoint focuses on politics and regional interests in America on the world stage during the early 1800s, essentially the time period after the War of 1812 and prior to the presidency of Andrew Jackson. The focus, of course, are key concepts 411D, 423D, and 432, which are essentially the growth of American nationalism combined with the growth of regionalism within the United States, combined with the acquisition of new lands and the debates that that will cause. And I want to start first by discussing regionalism during this time period. First off, let's go back to that War of 1812. The War of 1812 showed a very ugly side of regionalism. New England was very much hampered by the war economically. The British blockaded the coast, and even though it actually ultimately benefited New England, it showed the fact that New Englanders felt that they were not that their decision was not their concerns were not being heard, actually damaged the nation. Furthermore, the Hartford Convention led to the death of the Federalist Party, but also showed once again the great divide over this war and the fact that there is three very distinct regions: the Northeast, the West, and the South. Also, kind of recap on the Great Triumvirate. We have new political leaders post-war of 1812, and these are really best defined by our big three. Representing Southern interests, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Representing New England's interests, Daniel Webster of New Hampshire, member of the Federalist Party. And then representing the West, Henry Clay, later on will be one of the early founders of the Whig Party. And finally, also in regards to regionalism, is going to be the ideas of expansion. As more and more states are coming into the nation, we are going to see debate, especially regarding slavery. Many of the southwestern states, for example, that are formed during this time period are going to be formed because of the expansion of the cotton industry, the need for more land. And as we see that happening, that's going to further bring up this issue of slavery. What is going to happen with slavery as we continue to expand? One of the most important ideas of the time period is something we studied extensively in class, Henry Clay's American system. And Henry Clay, once again, he's part of this great triumvirate. These three congressmen who are really going to dominate politics between 1820 and 1850. And his idea of an American system was much more national in nature. It was a way to bring the country together. And an acronym to help you to remember it is BIT. B for the Bank of the United States, I for internal improvements, and T for tariff. As far as the bank, a second bank was created by Congress in 1816. The fact that the bank had expired and was not around during the War of 1812 actually hurt the economy, as local banks sprung up all over the country, and the country was flooded by depreciated banknotes that hurt the war effort. This was modeled after the first bank, and most Jeffersonians interestingly supported the new bank. They used the same argument that Hamilton had used in 1791. Ironically, the Federalists, although on their deathbed, denounced the bank as unconstitutional. And like I said, they're going to wither away in a few short years anyway. A second major proponent of the American system, and the proponent that actually didn't fail to pass, were for internal improvements. This was the idea for Clay to link these three regions through transportation and infrastructure. And essentially, this idea that we could the country would be more together because of the federal government. Jeffersonians opposed this. They saw it more as a states' rights issue. And even though Congress passed this one bill that would have given funds to states for internal improvements, President Madison vetoed it as unconstitutional, and his successor also vetoed similar legislation. New England was opposed to it because they feared it would drain away their population and create competing states in the West. And most really prior to the Civil War, except for the railroads, most internal improvements, for example, the Erie Canal, were done at the expense of state and local governments. The third and final component of the American system was the tariff. And the tariff of 1816, the purpose, like previous tariffs, was to protect U.S. manufacturing from British competition. Following the War of 1812 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the British flooded the U.S. with cheap goods way below cost to undercut new U.S. industries. And this was really the first protective tariff in U.S. history. It imposed roughly 20 to 25% duties on imports. It wasn't really high enough to provide sufficient protection, compared with Hamilton's 10% tariffs in the 1790s. But it did start a protective trend that is going to divide the political parties up and through the post-World War I era in United States history as well. Generally, the South and the West were opposed to these new tariffs. Calhoun, for example, initially supported this 1816 tariff, but then he later opposed it, claiming it enriched, New England manufacturers at the expense of the South. Clay, even though he represented the West, saw tariffs as a way to develop a strong domestic market, and it was kind of his hope that Eastern trade would flourish under tariff protection, and that the funds could be used to help finance roads and canals in the West, although that never really came to fruition, which is why Westerners tended to be opposed to the tariff. And so we'll see this tariff as very much a regional issue that divides the nation. Once again, the Northeast pro-tariff, South and West against the tariffs. Although they will continue to pass, and we will see continued protective tariffs up and through the Great Depression. In 1816, President James Monroe was elected president, and after this, we're going to see the death of the Federalist Party. That pretty much was it. And in 1817, a term coined by the newspaper writer called the Era of Good Feeling came into existence. And this was the one period in our nation's history where we had a one-party system, although some factions within those parties. It's a very contradictory time period in American history. For example, we're going to see serious growth of U.S. nationalism after the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans had shown that we were capable of defending ourselves against a world power. Combine that with the death of the Federalists and the decline of economic and political dependence on Europe, and many Americans were optimistic about the future. Furthermore, westward expansion added to this optimism. New western states continued to enter the Union, Indiana and Illinois in the north, Mississippi and Alabama in the south. And, these states had not been around as colonies during the American Revolution, and so they were generally less interested in states' rights that many of the original 13 colonies were very much interested on. These new western states very much depended heavily on the federal government, where they had received most of their land. And there were, a wide diversity of peoples, especially in the Northwest states. And so we see this, continued with that. We're also going to see, and we'll talk about in our next PowerPoint, the transportation revolution, which is also going to improve westward movement and the use of steamboats and canals and so forth during this time period. Despite the growth of U.S. nationalism, despite them being called the Era of Good Feeling, this term is really somewhat of a misnomer. There are some very serious issues that still divided the nation. Like I said, this is emergent sectionalism between the East, the West, and the South, or the Northeast, the West, and the South. The tariff issue, which we previously discussed, in which the East was for, the Northeast was for, and the West and the South opposed. The internal improvements, which the Westerners were for, and the Northeast and the South opposed. The Bank of the United States, which was supported by the Northeastern, opposed by the West and the South. And, this combined with the issue of slavery, is going to, further increase American sectionalism despite the growth of American nationalism. Like I said, two contradictory terms, but both going on at the same time. The two major events of the Monroe presidency that are going to really have an impact are going to be the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And we'll see this as we go on. So first, 1819. This was an economic crash and depression that hit in 1819, really the first financial panic since the Articles of Confederation, and definitely since the ratification of the new Constitution. And interestingly, I've said in class, make sure always the word over-speculation is almost always going to be one of the causes of these various panics, which are going to occur about every 20 years. We'll see another in 1837, again 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, and 1929. As far as the causes of this panic, as I said, number one, and most important, overspeculation. Um, Banks have been overspeculation on frontier lands, especially the Bank of the United States, and as a result, these lands, once the panic hit, are going to be not worth as much as their mortgages that were owed on them. Furthermore, inflation from the War of 1812 and an economic drop-off after the war resulted in a vulnerable economy. And the fact that the British flooded us with cheap goods led to a trade deficit with Great Britain. Finally, this was an era of general inflation, and the Bank of the U.S. encouraged these inflationary practices. However, once the panic ensued in 1819, the bank itself responded with increased regulation of state banks. That's going to force several of these especially in the West, these banks to foreclose on Western farms that couldn't make their mortgage payments. And so, on one hand, it was these lax procedures of the Bank of the U.S. that contributed to this panic, but then more resentment towards the bank as these other banks are forced to foreclose on these mortgages and loans and so forth that had originated during this period prior to the era of good feeling. The results, we'll see quite a bit. Number one, continued increased opposition to the bank, especially by Western farmers. They view it as an evil monster. Later on, when President Jackson becomes president, he kills the bank. He's from the West. Poor classes were very hard hit, and we'll also see this result in later on with Jackson's presidency. We see a new democracy and increased suffrage for the poor. New land legislation will result in smaller parcels being sold for lower prices as well, ultimately leading to the Homestead Acts, which will exist afterward, where essentially Western land was almost given away for nearly free. And then finally, we will see widespread sentiment existing to end the practice of imprisoning those who couldn't pay their debts. Some states actually passed legislation reducing debtor prisons during this time period. Moving on, as I said earlier, the second major issue of President Monroe's presidency was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. A little bit of background on this was that Missouri, as a state, applied for statehood in 1819, and the House of Representatives passed something called the Talmadge Amendment. The Talmadge Amendment said that no more slaves could be brought into Missouri if it were to become a state, and it actually proposed a gradual emancipation of children born to slave parents who are already there. And the Southern response to this was serious fear about the future to slavery. Thomas Jefferson said that, is quoted saying that this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled him with terror. And Southerners feared for the future of the slave system. They saw the fast increase in the northern population and economy. They saw that the political balance in the House seemed to favor the North. Luckily for the Southerners, the Senate was still balanced with 11 free and 11 slave states. And Missouri was the first state entirely west of the Mississippi made from Louisiana Territory, and they were afraid that the Talmadge Amendment would set as kind of a precedent for the rest of the region to be free. If Congress could abolish slavery in Missouri, it might try later in southern states. And ultimately, the Senate refused to pass the Talmadge Amendment, and a national crisis loomed. And we're going to see Henry Clay as a savior. Henry Clay is known for three great compromises, this being the first, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Nullification Compromise in 1832 and the Compromise of 1850 are also part of Henry Clay's series of compromises. But the compromise regarding Missouri will be that Congress is going to admit Missouri as a slave state, and Maine is going to be admitted as a free state. While this didn't make a rule or a law of a sectional balance, we are going to see the sectional balance kept at 12-12 for the next 15 years. Future slavery would be prohibited north of the 3630 line, and the compromise was largely accepted by both sides. The North had the advantage as Spanish territory in the Southwest prevented significant southern expansion westward, and Southerners were not too concerned about lands north of the 3630, as that land was just not conducive to cash crop agriculture requiring slave labor. And the legacy, of course, is that It's going to last 34 years, preserves the Union, becomes kind of the law of the land until the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Slavery also is going to become a dominant issue in American politics and one of the most serious setbacks to this new era of American nationalism and American unity. And the South really begins to continue to develop its sectional nationalism of its own, looking to Western states who are seeking allies as well. Moving on, and finally, the last thing I'd like to discuss in this PowerPoint is foreign policy and expansion in the period prior to Andrew Jackson's presidency. First off, after the War of 1812, relations with Britain vastly improved. We agreed to less naval presence on the Great Lakes with the Rush-Bagot Treaty in 1817, and with the Convention of 1818, we agreed to fix the 49th parallel between America, the United States, and Canada at the 49th parallel through the Rocky Mountains. We also agreed to a 10-year joint occupation of the Oregon Country in the far west. We also convinced Spain to sign the Adams-Onis Treaty, or what we should simply call the Florida Purchase Treaty. We had already claimed land in West Florida where settlers had arrived, and Spain was beset with revolutions in South America, and they had to move their troops out of Florida to deal with these revolutions. And Florida became somewhat of a lawless territory. American Indians, runaway slaves, white outcasts poured across the border from Florida into U.S. territory and attacking U.S. settlers and then retreating south of the border. And President Monroe ordered Andrew Jackson to attack the American Indians, if necessary, pursue them back into Florida. And Jackson swept through central and eastern Florida during the Seminole Wars. He captured Spanish cities, deposed the Spanish governor, actually disobeying President Monroe's orders. Jackson also executed 2 American Indian chiefs and 2 British supporters of Spain. And Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who, by the way, was one of the best Secretary of States in history, although one of the worst presidents, convinced Monroe's cabinet to offer an ultimatum to Spain: either control the outlaws of Florida, which they were not equipped to do, or cede Florida to the United States. Spain realized they would essentially lose Florida regardless and decided to negotiate. And the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Spain ceded Florida as well as its claims to Oregon in the United States. We abandoned some claims we had in Texas that later became part of Mexico, and Florida joins our nation. The final foreign policy that I'd like to discuss that is really going to become the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the 19th century was the Monroe Doctrine. And as Latin America's democratic revolutions were increasing, certain European monarchies were concerned about these democratic movements, and they saw it as a threat to their absolute monarchies. And many were willing to actually help Spain reattain these newly independent Latin American republics. And we were alarmed at this hostility from Europe towards the democracy in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, Britain was also alarmed at the hostility, not because of democracy, but with Latin America liberated from Spain, it gave them a lot of business interests in Latin America. And Britain sought an alliance with us to protect these interests. We, of course, refused, believing that Britain wanted to hamper our own influence in Latin America. And the Monroe Doctrine, part of the President's annual message to Congress in 1823 and written by John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, essentially warned the imperial powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. They could keep what they had, but not gain any new ones. Allow the Latin American publics to govern themselves. Another interesting part, while we see this aimed at Latin America, was also aimed at Russia, who had designs of the Pacific coast coming down from Alaska into Oregon, where they had claims, and we were alarmed that they would go even further south. Nationalistic Americans really supported it. It maintained Washington's tradition of avoiding entangling alliances and keeping Europe out. Many of the Latin American countries weren't really sure what to think. In many respects, they saw the U.S. merely as protecting their own interests. And the immediate impact was actually very small. Our Navy and Army were way too weak to actually do anything. In fact, if anything, the British probably enforced the Monroe Doctrine far more than we did during this time period. But it is going to become this cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy during the last half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and will keep our interests remain in the Western Hemisphere rather than in European interests, at least until the Spanish-American War of 1898. And that is it for today for this lesson. Our next one will be topics 4.5 and 4.6, the market revolution.